All right, everyone. Welcome to the new JFK show number 289. We've got Alan Salarian tonight. He's an artist, and he and Jim Fetzer have been friends a long time. So go ahead and introduce Alan for us, Dr. Fetzer, and how y'all met.
Well, Alan is a psychiatrist who used to be the top shrink for the FBI until he started putting out too much truth about how the CDC was fudging their statistic to make it look as though there were an opiate epidemic that did not exist. And he was brutally treated that way. A raid on his home, they froze his accounts, they took his Mercedes, his computers. Desperate situation. He wound up living in Greece for years. I'm ecstatic that he's back in the United States and in New Orleans, Gary, where I know you are giving him an assist about getting around all the JFK haunts. Alan, we are simply delighted to have you here tonight.
Yeah, and
thank you very much. It's my pleasure. It's wonderful to be back, and it's wonderful to be your guest.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we think very highly of you, Alan, even though, as you know, we have certain disagreements about the subject of your presentation. So I just say you go ahead and lay it out, and we'll talk about it after.
Yeah, and
I love the disagreement. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about science. I think we should be able to disagree and say what we think. In fact, my own hypothesis is that the bad things that happened to me and really horrible things happened to me, I think did happen because of my JFK research. This is my own hypothesis. Yeah, I said a lot of things about DEA and the fake heroin crisis and this and that, but I cannot ignore the fact that after I published my saxitoxin article, and flash a theory of JFK being poisoned. The editor of Medical Hypotheses lost his job. I cannot believe that was a bad thing. And I spoke with him, and he did say, yeah, he thought there was some kind of foul play, but of course, there's no way of proving intelligent designs and traps. So that's only a suspicion. I say that's a hypothesis. I'm much more convinced about the fact that our intelligence services were utilized and were instrumental in President Kennedy's death. And how do I know this? I know this because of the throat wound. And now, I think, let me go to my presentation.
Sure.
Yeah. They want everyone to know that Alan is a fantastic artist and has done a lot of JFK paintings and all work. And from what I understand, a friend of mine that I hooked him up with, they're going to be getting together to get some of the, JFK paintings in his gallery. So that'd be fantastic.
Well, Gary, I
also have a website, and I want to
add in my library right here. I'm looking at it as I speak to you, Alan Salarian, Elm Street.
But this is also, I want to say, in terms of JFK conspiracy theories, look at it. When they raided my house and my office, and then ended up putting me in a federal prison without a trial, my 300 JFK and Oswald paintings vanished, and they were sold without my permission, okay? This is all accidental, supposedly, but then guess what happened? My own paintings were being sold on eBay for thousands of dollars. When I tried to track them and tried to cut some kind of deal, they vanished again. 300 paintings, and just the framing of it. At that time, I was rich and very fat. And so it didn't matter. The framing alone for my JFK and Oswald paintings was $70,000. Can you believe it?
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's not only medical hypothesis director losing his job, but my painting's getting lost. So I put one and one together, and I say all these things cannot be bad accidents or mishaps. So I'm a little paranoid about it.
Well, of course you are. Those paintings were not sold by accident, Alan. It was just no coincidence. They put them up deliberately to deprive you of the benefit of your own work. I mean, it's disgusting.
Yeah, maybe we can go to your website and check out some of your paintings sometime during the show. That'd be great.
Go ahead and screen share, Alan.
Okay.
Yep, we have a presentation by Alan tonight.
Okay,
One of his paintings right there.
the title of my presentation is What Caused JFK's Throat Wound. As we know, you're screen sharing.
No, you just press the down button, Alan. It'll move it. Just press about button. Yeah.
The ambush. Okay. On November 22nd, as we know, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on Elm Street in Dallas, Texas. It was an ambush, and JFK suffered injuries from 2 frontal entry shots on the throat, and also, in addition to several bullets, shattering the brain, severing the tentorium, and protruding the cerebellum out of the skull. Let's see. Next slide.
You want the down arrow, Alan.
Okay.
Just the down arrow. Don't use your cursor. Your
Okay.
cursor has nothing to do with this, Alan. Just hit the keyboard, the down arrow.
Okay. You're right. This is now I'm advertising my painting, The Last Ride, my painting of in Dallas. Now, highlights. JFK's throat wound was not inflicted by a bullet. How do we know this? This is because JFK did not suffer any injury to the cervical vertebra, and there was no exit wound, and no bullet was observed in the x-rays. And also, the forensic test was negative for copper residues, ruling out a bullet. Now, we know that JFK suffered a throat wound from the original Parkland Hospital reports and diagrams. And also, his throat wound, in addition, his immobilization before the fatal headshots, the fact that he was paralyzed or seemingly paralyzed, he did not move. And then he did not die instantly. Under normal circumstances, physiologically, when somebody is shot with so many bullets, especially headshots, you expect him to be dead instantly. That's instant death. The fact that he survived, at least physiologically survived, yes, he was neurologically dead, but he physiologically survived and his heart was still beating and he still had some evidence of life in his body. According to the records at Parkland Hospital, it should be considered slow death. This slow death can only be explained by a neurotoxin. Finally, and very importantly, the CIA Director William Colby and Mr. Charles Sansony, a contract weapons designer for the CIA, acknowledged before the Senate Intelligence Committee in 1975 of the existence of a top secret umbrella poison weapon capable to kill without detection. I think it was a marvelous, marvelous coded confession by William Colby, and I'm so thankful for what he did. Now, let's go over JFK's wounds for what we know. he was struck by many shots. One was on the throat, one on the back, one on the right temple, and 2 or 3 bullets shattering the brain, severing the tentorium, and protruding the cerebellum out of the skull. But these shots came later. The throat wound. Several Parkland doctors described the throat wound as a bullet entry wound of 5 millimeter diameter. During a press conference at 3:15, Malcolm Perry explained 3 times that this was a wound of entry. The medical staff at Parkland was in complete agreement that this was a frontal shot. Speaking for the Parkland medical team, Charles Crenshaw witnessed a small opening about the diameter of a pencil at the midline of his throat to be an entry bullet hole. The autopsy records reveal diagrams showing a small throat wound. The official autopsy report stated that the throat wound was large and represented an exit wound. However, it has been proven that JFK's throat wound was deliberately enlarged by Dr. Hume, the pathologist, and we all thank, I think, Jim Fetzer and David Mentek for their extraordinary work proving this. This is my own diagram of the throat wound, JFK's throat wound.
Wow.
Now, let's go over William Colby's testimony in September 75. Colby, Richard Helms, the former CIA director, Mr. Charles Sansony, a contract weapons designer for the CIA, in his testimony before the Church Committee, acknowledged that U.S. intelligence services had developed a special neurotoxin weapon that could strike a human without his knowledge of the person who had been struck, but also the toxin itself would not appear in the autopsy. I mean, these are 2 crucial statements. It's such an intelligent poison that cannot be detected right on the spot. You cannot easily diagnose it. So you really have to do complex thinking and complex proving that something like this happened. This is why the medical information that I provide become much more compelling, because no other explanation can explain some of the things that are medically proven and therefore historically significant. This is not original material, I should say. The biggest credit should go to Sprague and Cutler and their definition of the weapon in an article published in 1978 in Gallery magazine. Wonderful, wonderful, hypothetical, but very compelling article. Now, my article that led to the firing of the medical hypothesis editor was this one, that a poison arrow assisted homicide, but it was, at that time, I did not have all the evidence that I now have. So it was a hypothetical article, but I published it. This is a diagram, my diagram from Sprague of the poison weapon. It's in the shape of an umbrella, rocket launcher, and wire conductor, trigger, and battery. Now, a few words about neurotoxin or saxitoxin. Saxitoxin is one of the most common and well-known neurotoxins. It's the best-known paralytic shellfish toxin, a highly potent non-polypeptide neurotoxin of low molecular weight. its chief action is an interference with the production of action potential nerves and involuntary muscles. And it's 100 times more powerful than cocaine. Saxitoxin causes paralysis due to reduced sympathetic tone and hypotension, low blood pressure. Animal studies indicated that with 0.0 saxitoxin, muscle fibers were rendered incapable of producing excitability and has been pharmacologically utilized to treat anal fissures due to its anti-bruising properties. Again, this becomes important in terms of recognizing that some of the wounds of JFK did not show bruising. As importantly, this is a key point. Saxitoxin has a very, very short 1 or 2 seconds latency period before it works. So once you're shot, within 1 or 2 seconds, you're totally paralyzed. This is the wonder or the malignancy of this horrible poison. Now, if somebody has a fleshed injury or poison arrow injury, what are the things that we're supposed to find? We're supposed to find a small entry wound. We're supposed to find no exit wound. We cannot see it in X-rays. It's not easily observable by physicians or healthcare professionals because of its small size or its dissolves, and it may leave soft tissue injury. Now let's compare it with the findings that JFK had. He had all of them. He had a small throat wound, no exit wound, no fleshed in X-rays, no fleshed observed by Parkland doctors, and bruised trachea and right lung apex contusion. So it's a perfect match. One other argument that has been proposed is by my good friend and scientist David Mantek, claiming that perhaps these injuries were caused by a piece of glass, but they cannot explain all those things. Maybe they could explain a small throat wound, no exit wound, but it cannot explain the bruised trachea, nor it's not here, or the delayed death. Now, what are some other saxitoxin or neurotoxin effects? Anti-bruising, paralysis, vocal paralysis, hypotension, low blood pressure, and reduced sympathetic tone. And now, anti-bruising, there was no pallor mortis reported by the mortician. Paralysis, he was observed to be immobilized, and he did not have a fight or flight response. Governor Connolly was screaming and yelling and fighting and moving. JFK didn't move. He was immobilized. This is unnatural physically. Vocal paralysis, total silence. Everybody confirmed this. He was totally silent. He did not make any silence. This could happen, as David Mantek pointed out, if the voice box was hit. Hypotension, his slumping motion explains this or is consistent with that. And also no instant death upon fatal headshots. So some of those things like slumping motion and no instant death and no pallor mortis match the saxitoxin effects, and they do not match David Mantek's glass theory. Here's one of my favorite JFK paintings. A friend of mine from California actually purchased this. It's one of my favorite paintings. It's in California now. Two brothers.
Yeah.
Now, did a bullet cause JFK's throat wounds? I think at the very beginning of this presentation, I said this will be a repetition. The throat wound was not caused by a bullet because of a forensic analysis revealed no copper residues on the throat wound. Furthermore, JFK's x-rays did not show any cervical damage. It's really medically, physically impossible for a bullet to enter from here and not to damage the cervical vertebra. It's just an impossibility. And the autopsy revealed neither a neck exit wound nor a bullet. This is one of the Zapruder images, 255, I think. I would say JFK is in distress and seemed to be immobilized, but trying to reach his throat. You know, it's very difficult to speculate on this, but this is another picture of immobilization, and he is grasping his throat. Now, to me, the most compelling evidence for a saxitoxin theory is the cover-up. Really, much more than the medical evidence. I would say the cover-up itself is so compelling because cover-up is so specifically and intelligently designed to cover up a crime of this kind. Otherwise, why would you lose his brain? What would that do to cover up? We know he had a brain shot, so that's not a top secret. But if you lose the brain, you make sure that saxitoxin is not found. What else? Why would you lose the tissue samples of JFK? Why? If it's assassination by Oswald or some other crazy guys, why would you lose the tissue samples? You lose the tissue samples to make sure that saxitoxin is not found. Why would you wash off the presidential limo? For God's sake, before the president died, they were washing off the presidential limo. Why? If it's a bullet wound, if it's Oswald, there is no need to wash off the presidential limo. But if you're trying to get rid of saxitoxin, you may do that. Audiovisual cover-up. You know, we saw fake stamina signs in the Z movies. This is, again, credit goes to others, to Fetzer and Rivera, I think. Movie alterations to conceal the shooter and the fake shooter testimony. What else? Why would they enlarge the throat wound? Yes, it fits their theory that perhaps this was a back entry bullet wound, but it also matches a cover-up for a small entry wound. If you take this all together, the complexity of the crime and the cover-up is a perfect match for the poison-fleshed cover-up. Now, to put all the facts together for poison fleshed evidence, there are 13 of them: small entry wounds, no exit wound, no damage, no bruising, a small entry back wound, lung contusion corresponding to the back small entry wound, JFK instant vocal paralysis, paralysis and immobilization, JFK's delayed or slow death. The umbrella man with an unobscured view of JFK opening and closing the umbrella during the ambush. William Colby testimony confirming the existence of a silent neurotoxin weapon to neutralize large and dressed dogs, suggesting that this weapon was designed for humans. Morticians report that JFK's body did not show discoloration hours after JFK's death, consistent with saxitoxin anti-bruising effect. The mathematical odds is 99.97 that this is correct. Mathematically, all these findings cannot be coincidental. This is a statistics. Yeah, there is a little chance, 0.001. But mathematically, neurotoxin was utilized in JFK's assassination. Now, was it a bullet or poison fleshed? Perhaps a repetition of earlier things. The evidence, size and shape can be both true for both of them. No exit wound, it's not possible with a bullet. No cervical damage, it's not possible for a bullet. Vocal paralysis, no. Paralysis, no. Slow death, no. Lost tissue samples, no, 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 no. So there is only one that would support the bullet and 12 that would support a poison fleshed. Umbrella man. We don't know the true identity of the umbrella man. Maybe others know, but I don't know. But there are a good number of pictures of an umbrella man and umbrella resembling what William Colby described and Sprague and Cutler depicted in their article. And now here, in one of the Zapruder frames, you can see that he has a direct shot at JFK. At the very same moment that JFK, I think, is grabbing his throat. This is the end, and this is John Jr. Goodbye.
Wow, that was awesome.
Farewell. Acknowledgement references. Again, everything that I put in this, I'm really echoing or borrowing information from all the geniuses like Fetzer and Mantic and others, Rivera, I mean, and Colby, William Colby. This has been described. I think that I find some pride in my ability to put the pieces together. That's all I'm going to say, but my information is based upon all this fantastic research that has preceded me, thanks to so many JFK researchers and people who love the truth. And that's really my obsession. I mean, this is why I paint. I couldn't express my indignation and rage and disappointment as an immigrant coming to this country for all the ideals that JFK and the US Constitution represented, and then witnessing and learning about JFK's death and recognizing that it was an inside job, and even so many years later, we're still covering up and lying like so many other things. And that's what my paintings are all about. But I come back to science now and take questions or criticism.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead and hit the screen share button and stop screen share.
Stop share.
Yeah, that was an excellent presentation. I really enjoy the paintings in between, especially the one of the two brothers. That was a good one. And also the throat wound was excellent too. I really did like. All right, Dr. Fetzer, you don't particularly agree 100%, or
Alan knows. What I'm wondering is whether we ought to let this simmer and invite Larry next week. But I mean, you know, there's a lot I could say, but I don't have my slides prepared to substantiate. My take is very different. I do not believe a neurotoxin was involved here. I mean, just to give a thumbnail sketch, what Alan talks about as a possible event that could have occurred is impeccable. It's a possible event that could have occurred, but the facts do not support it. If we went back to his initial assumptions, there are about a half a dozen initial assumptions he made that appear to me to be false, and they undermine. For example, Alan talks about a delayed death. Well, a physician who prepared the body for a funeral, Thomas Evan Robinson, observed there was no facial discoloration, which meant that he died instantly. And in fact, I believe the throat wound, hit bone, fragmented. Part went upward to sever the tentorium, part went downward into the right lung. This was the hypothesis of Robert B. Livingston, MD, a world authority on the human brain, where his observation, I believe, was most telling, to wit, that cerebellar as well as cerebral tissue could not have been extruding from the wound at the back of the head unless the tentorium had been severed. He was, in addition, an expert on wound ballistics. He'd supervised an emergency medical hospital during the Battle of Okinawa for injured Okinawans and Japanese prisoners of war. He assured me that even near simultaneous shots to the head would not have allowed cerebellum to extrude, would not have been sufficient to rupture the tentorium. And since there's no other shot that can account for that, his inference was the show shot, hit wound, part went upward through the brain and severed the tentorium, which then was accumulating some blood and tissue until they brought the limousine to a halt and he was hit in the right temple. And of course, well, initially it was in the back of the head, but then he slumped forward. Jack eased him up, is hit the right temple, and David believes now near simultaneously the side of the head. So we're altogether 3 headshots. But actually, you see, JFK was wearing a very heavy corset. It was cinched up tight. This was because of his injuries accumulated in World War II. He sustained while saving a fellow sailor after his PT-109 was sunk by the Japanese. He was cinched up tight that day. And we know a bullet passed through the windshield, hit Jack in the throat, small clean puncture wound. Malcolm Perry 3 times described it as a wound of entry. These Parkland physicians were well experienced with gunshot victims, gunshot wounds. Dallas at the time may have been the homicide center of the universe. But if Bob's conjecture is correct, and I don't see how he can be wrong, then that bullet fragmented. Why do we not see it? Why does Allen say we don't see it in the x-rays? The answer is pretty simple. JFK was a naval officer. His x-rays from his naval service were in Bethesda Naval Hospital. So if they needed to swap out an x-ray to conceal cervical damage, which is a key part of Allen's argument, they not only could find an x-ray replacement, they could find a JFK x-ray replacement, which is exactly what they did. I believe the claim that he still had a pulse at Parkland is bullshit. I believe he was already dead, just as Thomas Evan Robinson observed. And that if Bob Livingston, I reiterate, this guy was perhaps the leading world authority on the human brain at the time, is correct. And he also believed, by the way, JFK's reaction of bringing his hands up to his throat was a reflex, the Thorburn reflex. He told me that himself personally. And, those who are non-physician, non-experts, and want to poo-poo the Thorburn reflex, I got that from Bob Livingston directly when we were flying to Dallas for the 1993 conference, where he and David Manick would present their results, where David was explaining how they'd altered the x-rays that conceal the blowout at the back of the head. Bob would explain how they'd made the substitution of another brain for the brain of JFK. And of course, we know, and Allen's quite correct, that they enlarged the throat wound. In fact, Bob Livingston lived in Bethesda near the Naval Hospital because he was a scientific director of the National Institutes of Neurological Diseases and Blindness. He was a scientific director of two of the National Institutes of Health. He called over and spoke with Commander Holmes, who was going to be in charge of the autopsy, to explain that since there had been a wound of entry into the throat, that he must very carefully dissect the note. And if there had been any other shots from behind, then we knew there was a conspiracy, because we had a shooter in front and a shooter behind, and we only need two or more to constitute a conspiracy. We now know from our research there were 8 different shooters, not just one, and they were all over the place. The shot to the throat was fired from inside the triple underpass, passed through the windshield en route to its target. When Thomas Evan Robinson was preparing the body for funeral, embalming fluid was leaking out of 2 shrapnel wounds to the face, which he had to back with wax, which David Manick brilliantly inferred had been caused by tiny shards of glass that had been freed when the bullet passed through the windshield. Now, David believes the wound itself may have been from a chunk of glass, but I do not accept that any more than I do Allen's reconstruction. It was a bullet, and Bob got it right. It hit bone and it fragmented. You see, on Allen's or David's interpretation, there's no explanation for the severance of the tentorium. And if you cannot explain how the tentorium was severed, then you have not succeeded in your argument. So the 2 most important points I make: he appears to have died instantly. Thomas Evan Robertson's observation: once you're dead, you're not going to talk. He was not capable of much motion because of the corset. When he was hit in the back of the head, he did slump forward. Jackie eased him back up, hit the right temple. He'd already been hit in the back of the head, hit in the right temple and the side of the head, slumped to the left. Jackie climbs up, going after a chunk of his skull and brains on the back of the trunk. She holds his head all the way to Parkland, and she testified to the Warren Commission that from the front, he looked just fine, because this wound to the right temple was relatively insignificant, but she had a terrible time holding his skull and brains together at the back of his head. And I think she testified accurately, but which, of course, the Warren Commission did not publish, falsely claiming as deference to her privacy, but it's because her testimony blows the whole lone gunman, all shots fired from behind, out of the water from scratch. So if you just took Jackie and she was up close and personal, here's something else, of course, that has the same effect. Clint Hill, who rushed up from the Cadillac, and both cars, I believe, were motionless when he ran up. I mean, this guy was not a world-class sprinter. When he ran up and pushed Jackie back down, he lay across their bodies and witnessed up close and personal that fist side blow up to the back of the head, which again contradicts the Warren Commission report, and even made it into a book published 1991 entitled The Kennedy Detail, about the performance of the Secret Service in Dallas, where I've inventoried over 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up with a hit and covering it up. So, Alan, I admire you beyond words. I love your painting, but you knew coming in we had these strong differences. And what I propose is, let us have Alan come back next week, offer rebuttal, but give Larry the opportunity to present his views, and then you'll have all three of us engage in debate. How does that sound to you, Alan?
Yeah, I love it. I will do it. But two things that I'm going to bring up next week or now are that first, please think about the copper test as to why it was negative, because that rules out the bullet theory. And secondly, whether Livingston or Einstein or whoever says that a throat entry wound will not have an exit wound, it's impossible. It goes against physics. A bullet is thicker than vertebra. It will not just go to pieces, go up, down. It's a bullet. It will go through you. This is simple physics. There was no exit wound, no exit wound. Now, maybe they replaced the x-rays. Okay, they played a lot of funny things. But from the Parkland doctors, we know, and from all the evidence, we know that there was no neck exit wound, and the copper test was negative. Forget about all the other cover-up evidence that I'm producing in support of it.
Alan, how the hell do you know there was an authentic copper test, for God's sake? They were faking all the evidence in this case.
Okay.
That is the greatest.
That can be the argument all the time.
That is a methodological failure of your approach. You assume the evidence you're taking for granted is authentic when it's clearly fabricated.
That's a good point. Then I will listen. If you say everything is fake here, I will listen, but based upon the accepted evidence.
Look, there are two keys.
The cover up, Jim, the cover up. Why would they steal the tissue samples? Why would they wash the car? Why would they steal the brain? These are very specific things. It will serve no other purpose.
I think the answers are pretty obvious. They were performing destruction evidence. Lyndon had to have directed this. In fact, it turns out Sam Kenny, who is the driver of the Secret Service Cadillac, found a whole bullet, a whole slug in the car, and took it inside and left it on a stretcher. It became the magic bullet, but there was nothing magic about it. The wound to the back, by the way, did not transit. There was no front entry. It was shallow. It only went about as far as the second knuckle on your little finger. It was a loaded.
But why would
they were firing? They were firing. Alan, they were firing a Mannlicher Carcano bullet using a 30-06 with a plastic collar to call the sabot, and it was a home load. They put it shallow so it wouldn't penetrate very far, because it was just supposed to be proof that this bullet, which had been fired from the weapon they would claim Oswald had used, had been fired from that same weapon. So they were implanting evidence there. Sam Kenny found it, took it inside. Oliver Stone, I'm embarrassed to say, did a whole sequel to JFK, which he talked about the magic bullet, and he didn't even report that one of the Secret Service agents had found it. And even though David Mandick had done a CAT scan and demonstrated that it was anatomically impossible for the bullet to enter the back of the neck and come out the front of the neck because cervical vertebrae intervene. And by the way, Alan, that contradicts your hypothesis about a bullet being stronger than bone, because although steel is stronger than bone, David made the impeccable point that there was no way it could have transited through the neck, which is why Arlen Specter, when he questioned Malcolm, the doctor who actually performed the incision, said, if we assume the bullet entered here, if we assume it passed through the neck without any bony structures, then would that not be consistent with describing this as a wound of accident? And Malcolm Perry, of course, agreed, but he qualified by saying he was not in a position to vouch for or verify the assumption he'd been asked to be made because he knew they were bullshit. So, you know, I mean, they were very clever how they went about this. Now, I repeat, I have great admiration for you, my friend. The interesting thing about the government, they left the shirt and the jacket behind at Parkland, by the way. They did not take them to Bethesda in contradiction to standard protocol. And we know exactly where the bullet hole is in the back and in the shirt. David Mandick in the National Archives even had a member of the staff put on the shirt and the jacket. And notice the hole in the shirt is just ever so slightly lower than the hole in the jacket, meaning it had been fired from a downward angle, but it was actually fired, it appears, from the top of the county records building by Harry Weatherford, who was a Dallas deputy sheriff using that 30-06. There's more to the story, but I think we're engaged, Alan. We're engaged. And I say, hey, let us bring in Larry next week to address this issue. He'll watch this, and he will give us his take, because, Alan, we've done a lot of work on the throat shot. We went to Dallas. We went inside. We figured out the trajectory, the exact location from which it was fired. We know what
Well, you know that David is on my side on this.
Larry, I'm talking about Larry.
David Mandick on my side. That this
I'm talking
was
about
the bullet
Larry.
wound.
I'm not talking about David. I'm talking about Larry.
Okay.
Larry.
But
Yeah, let's bring
David
Larry
on my
next.
side.
Gary was with us when we
Trust
started
David.
this off. We even know what rifle was used. I mean, we have nailed this thing, Alan. And look, I think you're a wonderful guy. You're a dear friend, and I hate to be, butting heads with you,
It's
my
okay
friend.
to disagree. I love you and I respect you so much.
Well,
Nothing.
I feel that way about
Nothing.
you. I feel that way about you, Alan.
Okay,
That's the
nothing.
first time
Okay.
we had a debate where everyone would actually shake hands at the end. Yeah, let's bring in Larry next week.
We'll get this to Larry. We want you back next week, Alan, and we'll continue our discussion. This is wonderful. Wonderful. I'm thrilled to have you here, my friend. I'm so glad you're in New Orleans and in the good hands of my friend Gary King.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Get
thank you.
together.
Dave.
So, all right, this has been JFK number 289, and we'll continue this debate next week. All right. Thanks, everyone.